now that we are here anchored at the tail end of a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere, I thought it would be appropriate to address this subject for once and for all. I'm going to tell you what's the best anchor and what are the bad anchors, what kind of anchoring gear do you need, and how to use that gear effectively. So let's get right into it. What's the best anchor, or what's a good anchor? So I would say if you go with any of the so-called modern new generation anchors that have done well in some of the recent testing, then you are probably gonna be good. So if you choose a Rocna or a Rocna 1, and I'm gonna have to look at my list here, a Spade, a Vulcan, a Mantus, an Icicle, a Viking, or possibly a Cobra, which is kind of a wild card that I'm gonna talk about a little bit later. But this is a list that I have compiled myself out of the various options out there, just looking at all of the testing that has been done. Out of these, I myself have used the first generation of Rocna and a Spade and a Cobra extensively. I've also used the Bruce and the CQR anchors quite a bit, but our current choice is actually none of these anchors, and I will reveal it to you in just a bit. But let us first talk about what the bad anchors are. The anchors that just are not, objectively speaking, really that great anymore are pretty much everything else that I didn't mention, including the older anchors like a Bruce or a CQR or even like a Delta and so on. These are really popular anchors and you can do really well anchoring with them, especially if you only anchor in a certain type of a seabed. I'm gonna have to clear the lens a little bit. So if you are using a Bruce anchor and you are anchoring with a good technique and you mainly anchor in a soft seabed, then you are going to be doing just fine, and you're gonna be doing better than someone that uses a really expensive modern anchor and doesn't use the correct technique. But someone who uses a modern anchor is gonna be doing well in the soft seabeds where Bruce does well, but the one who's using a modern anchor is also gonna be doing well in other types of seabeds that are more difficult for anchoring. The same applies to CQR. Lots of happy users out there, but objectively speaking, the testing shows that that it's just not as good as the modern anchors. The holding power is not as good. It has problems setting and resetting and so on. And the same goes for a Delta, a very popular anchor. It's pretty cheap, so a lot of boat builders put it on their boats. It comes standard on many boats, but it's just not as good as the other anchors that I mentioned. Some other anchors that I think would not work well as a primary anchor would be the Lumar Epsilon. It's a newer anchor that just hasn't done really well in any testing. Then the Fortress and Danforth anchors, they are good as secondaries, but they are not good as a primary anchor. Then also all the Fisherman and the grapnel style anchors. I will not get really deep into what sets the modern anchors apart from these, but all the anchors that I mentioned earlier on in my list have a similar idea with concave or flat flukes with a large area, and they also have very heavy tips with a large tip to overall weight ratio. For this boat right now we have a Vulcan, and the reason that we chose a Vulcan is not because it's ultimately not because it has done really well in the holding power tests and so on. It has done well there too, but there are other things that come into play when you are choosing an anchor, and these are the things that people don't really talk about, but they are really, really important. So one of those things is, how does the anchor fit on your bow roller? Because some anchors, when they come up on the bow roller, this is your bow roller, and the anchor is coming up here, this is the shank of the anchor, they go really high up before they turn like this and come along your deck. And the Vulcan here is a little bit special because it turns pretty much immediately as it meets the bow roller. We simply didn't have the time or inclination to start making like cardboard models out of anchors and seeing whether the anchor is gonna go past our bow head sail furler or not, you know. If the anchor goes up like this, it's often in danger of hitting your head sail furler. The other thing that the Vulcan does really well is that it launches very aggressively. It has a lot of pull downwards when it's in its resting position at the bow, so you don't need to go and kick it or something to get it over the bow roller. Another thing, and this is probably the most important, is that the Vulcan does not have a roll bar. I'm not personally so fond of roll bars, even though I had a Rocna 1 which had a roll bar, and I did really well with that anchor. I was super happy with it, but I was anchoring in pretty easy conditions back then. And later on there have been a lot of reports from Rocna users that the roll bar can get clogged with kelp and other kinds of stuff, and then the anchor has problems digging deep and resetting. They now came up with a new version of Rocna, the Rocna 2, but the jury is still out on that one. This potential problem with the clogging of the roll bar is just something that I didn't want to deal with. And even more importantly, what the roll bar does is that if you have the anchor on the bowsprit, the roll bar is gonna be in front of the furler or in front of your bow, and it's gonna possibly interfere with your bowsprit. So we don't have one at the moment, but if we ever want to install a Chenaker sprit, like an extendable bowsprit, then the roll bar would be in the way. So in the end, for us, it came between a Spade and a Vulcan, and the Vulcan just won because I got it with free shipping and it was slightly cheaper. So now someone's gonna say, hey, what about having multiple anchors? You know, I have these and these anchors and I use them for different kinds of seabeds, and someone might say you need to have multiple anchors to survive out there. And to that, I'm gonna say that used to be a thing, but it's not true anymore. So nowadays, the modern anchors are just so good, and they are good in, you know, all kinds of seabeds that you are gonna anchor in, so that when you have a modern anchor, you don't need several anchors. If you look at boats that are cruising around the world and are going on long trips, and people who have a good amount of budget, because money definitely does play a role as well, then you will most probably see that they only have one anchor at their bow. They only have one anchor ready to use, and that's gonna be the anchor that they use 99% of the time or 100% of the time. But you do need at least one backup anchor, and you know, someone might say, hey, you might want to get like a third anchor that you just store in the bilge, something that can be disassembled and so on. We only have two anchors, and our second anchor, and this is what I would recommend for a lot of people as well, our second anchor is a Danforth type anchor. So Danforth and Fortress type anchors are really good in nice easy seabed. So if it's something like, you know, something relatively soft, then these anchors do really well, especially when the angle of the pull doesn't change. So these anchors, you can size them pretty small, and they have some of the best holding power in relation to the weight, and they fold flat. They are pretty easy to store, so those are kind of like good auxiliary and backup anchors. We use ours quite a bit when we have to use a stern anchor. So when we have two anchors out and we know that the angle of pull is not going to change, then we use our Danforth quite a lot, and it does really well as long as the angle of pull doesn't change. Later on in this video I'll talk about a few highly debated subjects such as anchor swivels and anchor chain selection, and also about catenary and how it does not work the way that most people think it does. But before we get into that, let's take a look at what our usual anchoring process looks like and how we set up our anchor alarms and so on. First of all, we have to get into the anchorage, and that's gonna be the tricky part here. So we are gonna go through here and then between this reef and the mainland and then into the anchorage. And right now what we have going on is I have the centerboard halfway down, but it is not locked. So if we do end up hitting something, that's gonna serve as an additional echo sounder. Our entrance is somewhere over there. So we have all of our information here. We have a harbor book, navionics, plotter, everything out here. Alright, we are in the bay now, we are safe here. It was a little bit exciting because there was a bit of swell in here, or just a bit of chop and still a bit of wind. And you don't really want that if you are hitting something, you know. If it's completely flat, calm water, then you are fine to hit rocks. But if there's a bit of chop, then you don't want to hit anything. One thing here is, of course, that you want to enter a sketchy anchorage like this at a half tide and on a rising tide. That would be the preferable time to enter, because then if you hit a rock, or in the worst case if you get stuck on a rock, then the tide is gonna come up and float you back up and you can just float away. But now let's get on to the next step of this process, and that's gonna be, in this bay we are not completely sure of the depths, and these areas are often not that well charted, and because of the 1964 earthquake, you know, some of the ground has lifted and so on. So what I like to do, especially if there is big winds coming like there is tomorrow, I'm gonna go and just drive towards the shore and see where the land starts coming up. So basically I'm just gonna use my boat and drive around with the echo sounder and check the depths. At least, because we are expecting south wind, I will at least check the depths towards the north, where the wind is going to be pushing us, but also probably towards the south. So then I know how much scope I can let out when I lower the anchor. And now we are maybe 50 feet from the shore, less than 20 meters from the shore, and we still have 13 meters of water. That's gonna be what, 40 feet of water. And while I'm doing all of this, while I'm going around in the bay, I'm just keeping an eye on the depth sounder and making a mental map of the depths here. So now I've already noticed that it's pretty flat and it's around 13 to 15 meters. And if you have an even anchoring bottom in the whole bay, that usually means that the bottom has to be something like mud or sand or something that's pretty good for anchoring usually. And now it's my job to keep the boat reversing, slowly reversing towards north, so that when Sohvi puts out the anchor chain, it doesn't get just piled up on top of the anchor. You want to lay out the chain in a nice long line. So now we have the amount of chain that we like, and we are gonna test and see that the anchor hopefully holds. So we're gonna test and make sure. Now what we do here is we're just using a piece of climbing webbing and Klemheist knot there, and then we are releasing the chain so that now all of the weight is on our strong point here, because I'm gonna be reversing quite hard, so I don't want to do it against the anchor winch only. I want to put the stress on something else. Throughout this process there's a couple of knots that we use, and I'm gonna put the instructions on how to make these knots down in the video description. So now I'm going to reverse against the anchor and test and make sure that it holds. So I'm first using quite low RPMs, you know, around idle, all the way until the chain is taut, and just giving the anchor a little bit of time to dig in. And then I increase RPMs slowly and give it another 10 seconds or so. And now I'm looking towards the shore, and I have a couple of landmarks there that I'm looking at just to make sure that we are not moving. Sometimes when you set the anchor, you know, the boat drags. You drag maybe for half a boat length or one boat length, but if you drag more, then it usually means, at least with our anchor and with the modern anchors, it means that the holding bottom is just not good. Usually the person who is at the front, they can tell if the anchor is really bouncing off of something. You can physically see and hear it from the way that the anchor chain is kind of like rattling and so. Some people say that they prefer to let the anchor set during a longer period of time. They say, you know, I'll just put the anchor down and let the wind do its work over several minutes or over an hour or so. And I think that's actually like not the way to do it. If your anchor is not setting properly by doing it this way with the engine, if you cannot do full RPMs with the engine backing against the anchor, then the anchor is just not set properly. So if you have good holding bottom, then I can do full RPMs and the anchor won't budge. If the anchor starts dragging, then you are pretty much gonna end up on the shore as well. So although I'm gonna show you how we set up our anchor alarms, the truth is, if there's a really big south storm here and the anchor starts dragging, there's a good chance that you end up on the shore anyway. So you want to make sure that your anchor holds. And when I'm doing it like this with the engine, with you know, now I'm at like 90% power. Just from like empirical experience, I think backing up with a 50-60 horsepower engine against the anchor at full RPMs or close to full RPMs, that's around the same force as at least 20-25 knots of wind. So if I do this, if I back up against the anchor with almost maximum RPMs, then I can sleep well even when it's blowing 20 knots. If it starts blowing 30-35 knots, then I'm still gonna be awake in the cockpit, and we're gonna have an anchor watch or something, a person making sure that the anchor is not dragging. Anyway, we are now satisfied that the anchor holds. Now I can just turn off the engine, and then we're gonna go back forward and set the snubber. So the anchor chain itself doesn't have any stretch, so we are gonna use our snubber lines here to introduce some stretch into the system so we don't have shock loading. What we do here is just a regular 3-strand nylon line. I think this is one of the best lines to use for this because it has a lot of stretch and it's cheap and easy. So if you don't have this and if there's any chop in the anchorage, you're gonna have quite a bit of shock loading on the anchor, and that's not good. You want to prevent that. So our snubber system is very simple. We use two separate lines, so we actually have some redundancy, and we attach them to these cleats when we are ready. We run the line through these holes at the bow here and attach them to the anchor chain with an icicle hitch knot. And this knot is type of a hitch that's very secure, but it's also easy to untie even after it's been under a good amount of load. We can use a knot like this because our anchor roller is open at the top, so the knot can go through and we can just tie the knot here comfortably. If you have a closed anchor roller, then you will be using something that has to attach to the chain, and we don't have any experience of that. We are lucky with the open anchor roller because we can use a simple system like this that doesn't have any weak links whatsoever, so we don't need to use a chain hook or anything like that. Anyway, now the knots are ready, and now we're gonna let out some anchor chain, and we're gonna let out at least 10 meters or so. You need to let out a decent amount, let's say a boat length or at least half a boat length for this to be effective, because if you have just a short amount of snubber out, it's not gonna provide much elasticity. So we're gonna let out like 10 meters. Now that we have the amount that we want, we're just gonna tie the snubbers to the cleats, and we're just gonna put the chafe protection in its place as well. So what Sophie has done here is she pulled both of these tight, so now the load is kind of equally resting on both of them, and now when we let out more chain, all of the load is gonna be on the snubbers and the chain is just gonna be loose. So there's gonna be like a loose loop of chain hanging in the water here. One small tip here is that you can actually let out quite a lot of chain at this point, so you create a big loop. You don't want the loop to be touching the bottom, but by creating a big loop there at the bow of the boat, you are kind of creating resistance in the water, because what most boats do, and what our boat especially does, is when there's wind, the bow likes to fall off from the wind, so the bow keeps going back and forth, and you want to kind of like slow down the movement, and letting out a big loop of chain kind of creates almost like a sea drogue in the water, so it slows down the movement of the boat a little bit in gusty winds. Now what we also do as just last step here on the foredeck, so we have attached the climbing webbing again, and now we're gonna let out some of the anchor chain to make it so that it rests on the webbing, and that is just an extra safety precaution, but mostly it's also so that the noise from the anchor chain doesn't get transmitted into the hull quite as well. So when the anchor chain is moving on the bottom and so, it produces some noise, and we are sleeping here in the bow cabin, so this is gonna reduce the noise just a little bit, just by like reducing the vibration.
Okay, bye. I'm going inside.
Yeah.
It's raining.
It's awful weather here. Absolutely horrible weather here. The storm is coming in. So now I'm gonna show you how we set up the anchor alarms. So now we will set up our anchor alarms, and we are gonna use two things for that: a cell phone and also the plotter. So on the cell phone I have a tip for you. If you have an Android phone, then I highly recommend these two apps. my anchor watch, and it looks like this. It has a lot of functionality, even the free version. And you can also set up like sectors. So if you're in a really tight spot, you can set up like forbidden sectors, and if the boat ends up going into a sector like that, the alarm is going to sound. The problem with this one and Android phones is that Android phones now have this feature that when the screen goes to sleep, the GPS turns off, and that's gonna cause the app to be very unhappy because it can't receive the current GPS position. So what I also use is called the anchor light, and it's a little bit more simple, but if you go into the settings, it has this feature which forces the screen to stay on. So you enable that feature, and then you leave the screen on at minimum lighting, so it doesn't use much battery, and then I just connect this to a power bank, and it can go like that for several days before running out of juice. So that's what I use, that's what I can take with me into the boat, and also have like next to my bed if I want to check how things are going. Then what we also have is our nice Raymarine plotter here, and we have an anchor alarm here as well. And what we can do with the plotter and what we cannot do with the apps is we can also set a depth alarm. So if we are in a really sketchy spot, then we can set a depth alarm. So if we drag onto the shallows, the plotter will start sounding an alarm. So that's a useful feature that we sometimes use. As a bonus feature, I want to quickly show you this thing here. It is an anchor riding sail, and the jury is still out on this one. We're just testing it out right now. So what's it supposed to do? It's supposed to stop the boat, or at least prevent the boat from yawing so much or sailing so much at anchor. Because what happens, especially with our boat, is that we have so much windage at the bow with the double head sails and so on, and we don't have much area underwater there. The hull is very shallow at the bow, so what happens is that the wind catches the bow and the bow starts going left or right. So you basically need more windage in the aft, and that's what this one is supposed to do. It seems to be working all right. It is doing something, but I'm not sure how much it's doing. The problem we have in these kind of anchoring holes that we are in, and especially with the mountains, is that sometimes the gusts really, the wind can change direction by 90 degrees, and obviously this thing, it cannot predict where the next gust is coming from, but it does turn the bow into the wind quicker than what we used to have. So it does help. It does lessen the motion of the boat at least a little bit, but how much and whether it's worth it, we need to do a little bit more testing. But really an interesting piece of equipment. You just tie it down at the back corners to your aft cleats, and then I have tied it close to the mast in the front, and then you pull it up with the halyard and you sheet it quite tight. So that's how it's supposed to work. Just one more trick to have in your bag of tricks, basically. Alright guys, a few things that I want to talk about before we finish this video. The first one is Catenary, I don't know how to pronounce that, and how it does not work the way that most people think, and how it's actually pretty useless in storm situations. So let's start right off, and if you don't know what Catenary is, I will show it to you right here. So I'll use this website svamanda.dk. There's a really good anchor rod calculator here, and I've set up a very simple situation here, a very basic situation. So we are anchoring in the simulation, we are anchoring in 5 meters of water, and the freeboard of our boat is 1 meter above the water. So we are 6 meters above the seafloor. Length of boat is 45 feet, and wind speed 20 knots. And then we are using 24 meters of chain, so that makes it so that we have a 1 to 4 scope. So we have 4 times the amount of depth of chain out. And let's do a 10 millimeter chain first. So this is a 3/8 of an inch chain. So this would be a very standard anchoring situation for like a 40-45 feet boat. And let's calculate this, and it's gonna draw us a nice image of what it looks like. So the anchor is laying here on the seafloor, and this is the catenary, this is the curve that the anchor chain forms, and it helps to kind of dampen the movement of the boat a little bit. But what it mostly does, or what's really good thing that it does, is that it makes it so that the anchor gets pulled along the seabed and in a horizontal direction, so it will hold a lot better. So as you can see here, the anchor angle is flat. The anchor is getting pulled along the bottom. And soon we will come to the storm situation where things look very different. But let's take a look at the same wind speed with a thicker chain. This would be 1/2 inch chain, so this chain size would be a little bit oversized for this type of a boat. And let's draw that as well. And here at the bottom you will now see it's pretty much the same, except that it lies along the bottom for even a longer time. But the end result regarding the anchor itself is the same. The chain is lying flat at the bottom where it meets the anchor. That's all good and great, but when we are talking about modern anchors and a situation where you've set the anchor properly, you are not really interested in a situation where it's blowing 20 knots, because if you have a decent seabed, your anchor is going to be holding no matter what. You don't really need the catenary, you don't really need the anchor chain to be lying flat along the bottom. So now let's increase the wind speed to 50 knots, and this might seem a lot to you, but this calculator here is calculating a static situation where the boat is not moving. So even if we had a snubber, we would expect that in a storm situation there would be chop and the boat would be moving. So you could easily have this kind of a stress on the anchor. So let's do 50 knots, and let's do 3/8 of a chain, and otherwise the same situation. And now we calculate it, and boom. So we have the chain being completely taut, and it goes like directly. There's no catenary left at all anymore. We have a 10 millimeter chain here, and so this is the subject of debate, because some people say, hey, I want to have a really heavy chain because then I will have catenary and it will help me if there is a storm. So let's do a 12 millimeter chain and the same situation. And once we calculate that, you can see, well, it's the same, you know, the angle that the anchor is seeing is about the same. So this is the point that I want to make about anchor chain selection. You should go to this calculator and play around with a few situations that are, you know, specific to your boat. But generally, when choosing anchor chain, I always think about the whole package the anchor and the anchor chain, that's a weight investment that you're going to have at the bow of your boat, and you want to invest that weight wisely. I would always invest more weight into the anchor and less weight into the anchor chain. So if you want to go for like a bomb-proof or an oversized setup, get an anchor that's like 2 sizes too big or 3 sizes too big, and get a chain that's suitable in regards to the working load, but don't oversize your chain. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to link to this great article in the Rocna knowledge base, and that discusses the scope versus catenary and basically says that scope is the king. They also have some simulated situations, and in this one, in wind strength of 50 knots, the catenary has disappeared, even though they are using a 12 millimeter chain and 6:1 scope. So the practical conclusion also in this article is that the chain can and should be as light as possible, and many boats could lose a large amount of weight by swapping to a lighter but stronger chain and then investing part of that weight back into a larger anchor. So that's why we are using 100 meters of grade 40 chain, and we have a 10 millimeter chain that's a 3/8 of an inch chain, and so this is like calculated to be the correct size for our boat with the working load that it's going to experience during a storm situation, but it is not oversized at all. If we upsize the chain size by 1 size, we get like I think around 70 or 80 kilos more weight at the bow, which is absolutely huge. Our anchor weighs half that. If I had a 120 kilo anchor at the bow, that would be like the same thing. And if I had more money, I might even go with a 8 millimeter G70 chain. That's a chain that has even higher working load, but that's like really expensive and gets kind of complicated with the chain, because the chain link is so small that you have to buy a special shackle to fit through there, a shackle that can fit through there and match the strength of the chain. Then a couple really quick points about some accessories. Some people like to use a swivel between the anchor and the anchor chain, and that's supposed to help the anchor to come up on the bow roller the correct way up, and it also keeps the anchor chain from twisting. We have never used a swivel. I simply have not felt the need for one. We haven't had any problems with our anchor chain twisting, even though we spend a lot of time anchored. And sometimes our anchor does come up the wrong way around, but then we simply use a boat hook to kind of just give it a bit of a tug, and then that's fine. There are definitely like really strong and good swivels nowadays that are available. The swivels have a bad reputation because there are like some really bad ones out there as well. So if you do get a swivel, get a good one and really do your research, and you're gonna have to buy one of the expensive ones, I think, if you want to have any peace of mind. Then the anchor windlass, couple words about that. I really like when it's an electric windlass, I really like these above deck models, which have the motor inside the housing. And we, when our old windlass broke, we bought the Low France Tigress, which is one of the most common windlasses that you can get. And we haven't, I can't really tell you that much about it because we haven't had it for that long, but it's a pretty popular one, and I like the fact that the motor is inside the housing, because if you have one of these units where the motor is under the deck, you are gonna have like really, it's gonna be hard to protect that from seawater and so on. Then last thing that I wanted to mention is the locking the anchor while it's up on the bowsprit. So some people have like a chain locker, they have like these things, these mechanisms that lock the chain in its place, but unless you can get the chain super tight and then lock it exactly there, then you're always gonna have some wiggle at the anchor. Some people drill a hole in the shank of the anchor and then put a pin through it or a shackle through it when the anchor is at its position. There it's the same problem, unless it's like super exact fit and super tight, then it's always going to be wiggling. So what we do is very simple and very convenient for us, is we just lash the anchor to our tow rail. Normally we just lash it to one side, but if we are offshore we're gonna lash it to both sides. And if you know how to lash the anchor properly, which is not really that hard, you can make the lashing super tight and the anchor is not going to wiggle at all. Alright, I think that was pretty much all that I wanted to say on this subject for now. I know that this was just a YouTube video about anchoring, just a quick look into how we do things and what we have learned over the years. Usually I don't really like to talk about, I don't really like to give that much advice, or I don't really make that many videos where I tell people how to DIY things or tell people how to, do electrical installations or whatever. And the reason is that I feel like I think there's just so many people doing that on YouTube, and so many people who are actually doing it for the first or second time themselves. So I don't want to do it because I'm not an expert in those things. But when it comes to anchoring, we have been doing this for several years now, and we've done it in pretty rough conditions and different kinds of setups and so on. So I feel like I have some kind of an idea what we are doing. This summer we are going to be attempting the Northwest Passage, so we are going to be sailing from Alaska to Greenland between Arctic Canada and North Pole, and it's going to be a huge trip, hugely challenging and so on. We are really preparing for it already, or we've been preparing for it for a few years now, pretty much. We're preparing the boat and we are preparing ourselves. Anyway, I've set up a website for this trip. Check out the link in the description. Then the usual thing, these videos are funded by patrons, and that's what keeps the videos coming. So it's kind of a crowdfunding thing. If you find these videos entertaining or useful or whatever, I hope you can go and check out the Patreon page. Patrons get access to a tracker with descriptions of the anchorages that we go to and so on, and then we have a private WhatsApp chat group, and we are also doing patrons only live streams every now and then, and we're gonna be doing some patrons only live streams also during the Northwest Passage, and so on and so forth. I think that was all for it for this time. I'll see you all next time. The next video is going to be a winter sailing video from this area as well, from Prince William Sound in Alaska, and it's gonna be a good one. So I'll see you all then. Bye bye.